Hey everyone, I'm Rick Beato. This is Tim Smith. You guys know Rhett. Today we're going to talk about specifically how you make a living in the music business. Now, I've talked about this in a number of videos in the past. Over the course of my channel, my situation has changed. I went from producing bands, working 12 hours, 14 hours a day, to making videos 12 or 14 hours a day. Tim has been out touring for how many years, Tim?
20-something.
Those of you that don't know Tim, we were in a video together recently, but Tim played bass in Jellyfish, and you've played with
Sheryl Crow for about 14 years, and I played with Neil Finn and his brother Tim Finn, the Finn brothers, and World Party I played with for a time, and Noel Gallagher's High Flying Birds for about 5 years.
And
pretty good resume.
And you guys know Rhett because he's been in about 100 of my videos and has his own channel. So let's talk about this, Tim. Tell me about how touring has changed and kind of your move from being in a signed band or even getting into a signed band, and what the music business was like back then with Jellyfish as to how it changed over the years.
Yeah, well, back in those days, in 92, 93, you could still get a record contract and you could get an advance and everybody could make some money off of that and you could live off of it. But as, you know, I think it's the Steve Albini post that basically says you'd make more money working at a 7-Eleven when you break everything down over the course of even a fairly well record doing fairly well. You know, you have to get out on the road and tour, and now that people don't seem to buy music the way that it was back then, making music by playing live is really the main way that musicians can make a living now. And so even big bands, I know that when I was playing with Noel, because he owns all of his publishing and his label and all that stuff, he's making more money because of that, which is a great decision that he made back in the Oasis days, but not everybody has that kind of cachet to broaden themselves out like that, but he's done it well enough to make a great living. So nowadays it seems like all the even bigger bands that I've worked with, because they can only really make money from touring, everybody's getting all their slices out of that. So everybody's got their fingers in that. And I think what's happened is that the musicians are I'm not going to say they're getting slighted, it's just part of the economy, the economics of what happens, but it's just not quite the same level.
Without being specific about the different musicians that you've worked with, what are the percentage of people that own their own publishing?
That I've worked with?
Yeah.
Not many.
Okay.
Yeah. Not many. And you get these big, you know, deals that a lot of bigger artists make that cover everything for a specific amount of time. And I think people now want to hold on to their publishing, but even that world, like, where do you make money in publishing now, unless it's in doing commercial work or getting your stuff in film scores and stuff like, or in the soundtracks and stuff like that.
Now, Rhett, what about you over the last 7-8 years with your touring?
So my touring, I got into music professionally about 7 or 8 years ago. And so my touring up until this point has been mostly with smaller regional and some national acts. So all of my touring has been in, opening direct support for bigger national acts, playing rooms from anywhere from 50, 60 cap to 300 or 400 cap, kind of in the category bands that are like trying to make it, or supporting singer-songwriters or artists that are trying to make it. And for me, I think it's, I don't have the background that like Tim has or that you have, so I don't know what it was like to tour through the 90s and early 2000s, but you can definitely feel how the industry has changed. To echo what Tim was saying, that everybody now, you make your money on the road, on merch, on ticket sales, on that kind of thing. So in one way it's good because artists, I think, are pushing to play live more, especially smaller artists that are trying to get discovered. So as a hired gun musician, that's a good thing. If you are in a city like Nashville a lot, where a lot of artists are kind of coming up and touring out of there, it's good because you can stay busy. The downside is if you're going to try and make a living strictly as a hired gun musician, like a lot of my friends are, you are out on the road nonstop, constantly. Then you come home and you jump on rehearsals for another artist, another tour, and you rehearse, get ready for that, and then go out for however long that is. So it's, it can be kind of an unhealthy way to make a living in that you're not really home a lot. And, it's kind of an interesting time, I think, in my experience.
I made my living as a music teacher in the 90s when I first moved here, when I met Tim. Tim and I I actually met Tim the second day that I lived in Atlanta, which was in November of 1994. I went to see, he was playing a duo at a club here, and a friend of mine told me, hey, the bass player from Jellyfish lives here and he's in a band. I said, oh my God, I love Jellyfish. And so I went down and I met Tim and we hung out and ended up starting to record together. And the next day you invited me over to work on what was to become the Umajets record. And I was teaching guitar lessons at a music store to make a living. Mm-hmm. Started a band, got signed, but really never made any money with the band. I mean, back then, when you got signed in the 90s, bands would get publishing deals. I had a publishing deal in 1991 before I even came here with Polygram, and then I signed another publishing deal with EMI in the early 2000, like around 2000 or so, I think it was. And every band that got signed would get offered publishing deals back in the day, and it would be anywhere from $350,000 to $500,000. That was just standard.
For those who might not know, what does a publishing deal entail?
Well, a publishing deal is, at the time, they were actually co-publishing deals. The typical deal would be they would give you an advance based on what they thought your value would be, and they would take 50% of your publishing royalty. For every dollar that comes in, 50 cents goes to the songwriter or is split between the songwriters. 50% goes to the publishing side. Now, if you do a co-publishing deal, which pretty much all of them were, 25 cents goes to the publisher, 25% goes to the publishing company. My publishing company was called Lonely Runner Music. Well, it still is. So for the money that came in, EMI would get 25 cents and I would get 75 cents if I was the sole songwriter, but I was always a co-writer. Yeah. So I would split the writer's share 50-50 and then split that 25 cents 50-50.
But then that's sales, but also radio play and stuff like
mechanicals
that. There are many different ways that you can skin that cat.
Yeah. Now, typically, I didn't make any money really through publishing until I started producing. And then when I started producing, I started having co-writes on records with bands that sold a lot of copies, like Shinedown, the first Shinedown record. I had, 3 or 4 co-writes on that, and that sold 1.5 million, 2 million records, something like that. Back in those days, you could make, you'd make about, if it was an album track, about $3,500. That would be it that you'd make even off a platinum record. If you had a single, though, you could make a lot of money. Yeah. A number 1 song or a top 5 song. I've said this on other videos. I was lucky enough to have a number 1 country song that brought in $1 million, not to me, in radio airplay, but it was split between 5 people back in the end of 2013. And then the mechanical royalties that came from the sales brought in another $1 million, which I didn't see any of the money from. So there was one windfall, and that was it. But that's pretty much all the money that came in from that. Yeah. And that's because there's no record sales anymore.
Right. It's all streaming.
I mean, a little bit of money comes in. You make it, $1,000, $1,500 every, maybe four times a year.
Every quarter.
Every quarter will come in like that. But in the old days, if you were Sting and you wrote Message in a Bottle, you'd be getting, maybe $750,000 a year. No, probably more than that. A couple $1 million a year.
You're breathing it in.
You're breathing it out. And then you start piling one song on another. Yeah. I mean, and you could become a millionaire as a producer. And I always talk about this too. 3 points, which is what a typical producer would get. And if you mix the record, 4 points. So if you sold 1 million records, you'd make about $300,000. And those 3 points, people say, well, that's not 3 points. That's $30,000. No, it's 3 points because you're making 3 points of $10. So it would be $300,000. So a triple platinum record would almost make you a millionaire, although you would have a producer, usually a producer manager that's taking a cut 15%. So you'd have to sell about 4 million records to make $1 million as a producer back in the old days. As record sales started to die off, big name producers, rock producers, whatever, would start charging a lot more up front. So typically you would get $3,000 per track, and you'd make your royalties after that, after the money was recouped. And then once that disappeared, then people would start charging $350,000, but then that wasn't even worth it. Then people just start producing their own records.
Right. Yeah. And here we are.
Here we are. So Tim, now talk about touring though. As far as what's the longest time period that you were out on tour?
Probably 12 weeks, something like that at one time. Well, mostly in my Sheryl Crow days. We would do 11 nights in a row. Her voice never needed to rest. So we were always out, and it was fun. It was, what I would say, what happens now, and some of the touring I've done where they're Nashville-based groups, where it's mostly weekend touring, so you get a bus on a Thursday and overnight to play to some town. You're going to play Friday, Saturday, maybe Sunday, or Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then you're back, and you have the first half of your week at home. And there are pros and cons to that. For me, I would rather be on the road and just get a momentum going, because it seemed like that third show of a run, you're just getting back into grooving and playing with each other, and then you're back home again.
Yeah,
that's my own opinion. It's good to, if you want to be home and be with your family and stuff more often, and that's a good thing to tour like that. But I prefer being out where you're literally putting the message in a box and driving the car around the world kind of thing for a whole span of time, and maybe have some breaks in there. But the detriment part of that is that you're not going to see your family unless you bring them out.
So Rhett, what's the longest that you were out on the road?
4 weeks, because like I said, most of the artists that I've played with, our longer tours have been as direct support or openers for bigger bands, bigger artists, and so we'll usually jump on a tour with them and follow. And then when it's headlining tours, nowadays I find that, from what I've seen, I think it's more sustainable for smaller artists to do more of that weekend kind of go out, hit a region, come home, go out, hit a new market, come home kind of thing. And I'm with you. I like being out because you're right. By that second or third show, you really find that rhythm and that groove. And then if you have two weeks out, 2.5 weeks out, by the end of that 2 week run, depending on what the band is, what the gig is, you could be playing something on a completely other level than you did when you first hit the road.
You're literally making music together.
Yeah.
And you can think, a lot of bands will play the same set list, but others will enjoy working around and changing arrangements and stuff just because you get bored.
Yeah.
And that's part of the fun.
Right. When's the best time to see a tour, Tim? What's the...
For me, it was always maybe the third or fourth week of being out. Once you've worked through all the normal stuff and you kind of found the right set list and you changed a few things and you see what works best and you're not too burned out. That's always the best time to watch musicians, is when they're not. Well, sometimes it can be fun when they're burned out too.
I find that everybody that watches this channel sees that I have a lot of equipment here that I've acquired over the last probably 16 to 18 years of being a producer. I started buying gear early on because I realized that most of the bands that I worked with, if they weren't signed, they had crappy gear. And if they were signed, they had crappy gear. It's pretty amazing because they'd be out with their stuff. They come in, their guitars would be covered in sweat and their pickups didn't work right. Or drums sounded terrible. They didn't know how to tune them. So I started buying things and I spent my money on gear. All the money that I made, I spent on gear because your success as a producer was dependent on having good sounds.
Tools.
And I always tell people, before you spend money on mic pre's or microphones or anything, buy great instruments and buy great amplifiers and great instruments, because even through cheap mic pre's or inexpensive mic pre's and microphones, they'll still sound good.
Yeah, well, and especially nowadays too, with the barrier to entry as far as recording a equipment, interfaces, and microphones now. I mean, if you have a 57 and maybe a $400 or $500 Focusrite interface, you've got a decent enough signal chain that with a couple of plugins you can throw it on and make it sound great if the source was great.
One of my first recording experiences here, or my first, was working with Tim with Umajets on that record, right. And Roger worked on the record. Roger from Jellyfish, Roger Manning. Yeah. And Shalom
Aberly.
Yep. Engineered and mixed.
We had one ADAT machine and a Mackie console, and I think we had a 414 and maybe a 57. That was about it. Just moving it around.
But that was really that's how I first saw people producing their own music before computers or anything. That was the first experience I ever had with. I mean, I had a 4-track cassette and things like that, but as far as actually making a record that way, that was my first experience, really, seeing that.
Yeah.
If you think about that in comparison to nowadays, all the stuff that is all the gear for that is developed because of home recording.
Well, I mean, that's I have this theory about the ease at which things become so available. How does that serve the struggle of an artist to be creative? When you have every option in the world at your fingertip and every plug-in and all that stuff, it's awesome. But I know you were talking about guitars and having good guitars and stuff. While I agree with you on most levels, for me, I would rather find a way to make a really crappy sounding old K bass or guitar do something unique and interesting on its own, especially for bass. When I played bass a lot, I always thought the tone of a weird 60s bass was more interesting than a super high-end, I call them furniture basses that are 6 strings and all this stuff.
That's the best thing I've heard to describe that, the furniture bass.
Yeah.
That's spot on.
They're amazing works of art and all that stuff, but for me, and unless you're playing jazz, I find them stunting.
Yeah.
Because I always feel like you get the best out of somebody by getting them to struggle with whatever they're dealing with. If it's your own voice, and I think John Lennon always said his favorite thing, or not John Lennon, Bono said about John Lennon, he enjoys hearing him sing Twist and Shout because he's not quite hitting the notes all the time. And there's a struggle to that. And I think the struggle part is what a lot of people today don't have to deal with gear, because they can just get these amazing things up immediately.
Yeah.
Okay, well, what are you going to say with that? And so still it's all about being moved emotionally by whatever you're creating. And hopefully people are finding, and they are, finding unique ways to use these tools and do something different.
Tim reminded me today that he said, you remember what your first guitar was when you moved here? And I had a Mexican Strat. That was all I could afford. And a PV Classic 50. That was my rig when I moved to Atlanta. That's
not a bad rig. You can do a lot with that.
Yeah. But I think I had changed out the pickups or something in the Mexican Strat. But I remember starting a session. I came in, the drummer started playing. I said, "Oh man, that snare sounds horrible." And you're recording. If you have a bad snare sound, that's pretty much sunk. And it wasn't a good bad snare sound, because there's some bad snare sounds that are great snare sounds.
Yeah.
But those are just a terrible snare sound.
Sure. I played a Hofner bass on the Jellyfish record that was an amazing instrument on the Spilt Milk record, the second record by Jellyfish. But the intonation about past the 7th or 8th fret, you just have to stop and retune it and just play that passage, and then stop and retune it. There just were not really well-made basses that had the ability to do the things that a lot of people want to do. And even some of McCarthy's stuff, you can hear them going sharp. And there is a little bit of a character to that, but and that's the fine line where you have to be careful.
Tim, I have a question for you. What would you say to younger musicians who are maybe in their late teens, early 20s, who are wanting to get into being maybe a hired gun musician or a full-time player? As someone who's been around in this game for a while, what do you think somebody who's coming into this nowadays needs to know, needs to understand, needs to be prepared for?
There's no jobs left. That's all I can say.
Don't even try it.
No, I think that, look, everybody has nowadays the ability to go, like we were saying, get really good gear. You can watch their videos about what's good to, how to plug things in and do all that stuff. And that's all great and helpful. I think the things that are most important about getting into this is about 85% of being on the road or getting a gig is just how you are around other people and how you can hang with other people. Because you really are in each other's back pockets all the time. And Jeremy Stacy is a dear friend of mine. He was a drummer who played with me in Sheryl's band and in Noel's band, and he now plays in King Crimson. He's like a brother to me, but there are moments where I couldn't stand him and I think I literally did punch him once in the face in Austin, Texas. But you develop these relationships with people that you have to be prepared to. Touring is, you kind of have to be willing to put up with whatever you couldn't even think of some of the things you're going to have to deal with. And that mindset, it's sort of like being a gypsy, I guess, but just be prepared for that. It's not, there's no roadmap to it. Even on the high end level of things, when you're moving and traveling, stuff changes all the time, and be ready for that and be ready to take on weird circumstances and adapt to them pretty quickly. Because people will just leave you behind if you're not, or they'll get somebody else.
It's very easy to do that.
Oh, totally.
There's always somebody ready to take your gig if you're not a good hang, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I've seen really amazing players lose gigs because of that, just because of their personality or whatever. And they even knew it. And every great player that I've played with has their own ups and downs and stuff. I always think being a sideman or whatever is like being a chameleon, and you figure out what's the weak thing in the band or in the dynamic of the emotions of everybody in the band. It's not just about how you play. You can change the way you play in a different group. If it's more of a jammy group and it's getting too jammy, you need to realize that it's time to lock into a rhythm section playing situation if it's just everybody's noodling all the time. It's always being aware of what's happening, because that's what music is reacting to what you're hearing. And being on the road is the same way. You're reacting to where you're going and what you're doing.
Let me ask you this. You're a great singer. How important is it as a sideman to be able to sing?
I've been really lucky because I got to play and sing with some really good singers.
If you didn't have that ability, would that have hindered your ability to do any gigs?
Yeah, and there are some great musicians that I've put up for gigs, but they didn't get them because they couldn't sing.
Yeah.
And I actually don't think singing is as difficult to do. Now, I say that because I can sing, but I think people out there that aren't sure if they can sing, just go for it. I think there's plenty of things that you can do. If you've got an ear to hear things in tone and pitch, that singing should be able to.
You've never heard Rhett sing.
Hey, listen,
Can you sing, Rhett?
It's funny you say that. Like, I'm in that place right now where it's like, okay, I think I can do it, and I know that I need to do it. So I've been like practicing on my own and reaching out to some really talented vocalist friends of mine and saying like, okay, what do I need to work on? But the challenge that I have is because most of the gigs I play, I'm the lead guitarist, so I'm playing parts either off the record or parts that I've written and stuff, and so most of my brain power is dedicated to playing the parts correctly, getting the tones nailed, and so trying to throw in singing some harmony stuff on top of that is proving to be a little challenging.
It's a little bit of this, you
Yeah.
know, but it's when you, it's like anything. It's just you got to practice and do it. I know that in Jellyfish, it's 4 singers singing 4-part harmonies, and we had to practice and rehearse every day to keep that going. And our sound engineer, Shalom, was almost the 5th member of the band because he was a singer, and he could hear things like, Tim, your R is not as hard as everybody else's, and you need to make that syllable.
Shalom was a pretty particular guy, though.
A little bit. A little bit.
Great, incredibly good sound.
Yeah. And it's, it's just one of those things where it seems like it's a drag, or if you don't feel like you're good at it, you just have to kind of keep pushing through that. Yeah. And even for ways that you, like, when I was playing with Sheryl Crow, I used to sing higher harmonies than her that she had recorded on the record, but I had to recreate these super high harmonies. I was able to do that. Yeah. But part of it was I had to just let go of my ego and say, I know I'm singing a duet with a girl that's about girls and sound like I'm a girl. But it's a character, that you're putting on, and you're just trying to bring the part of the song over. And I had to change the way that I sang.
So let's talk about some other ways to make a living. For example, YouTube, or you do gear demos, things like that.
Yeah, the YouTube thing for me is, I guess, relatively new. I've been doing it for about a year, and it was after watching you grow this thing over the last few years. And, I think from my perspective, as someone who's been doing this now, kind of getting close to, 10 years, in the first 10 years of their career, I learned pretty quickly that in today's market, you have to be able to do more than just play your instrument well. You have to know how to record. You have to know how to write. You have to know how to engineer. You have to know how to market yourself. You have to understand social media and all these things. A lot of my friends who have become really successful, either hired gun players or artists themselves, they all kind of have a combination of those things. It's not just, oh yeah, such and such is an amazing guitar player and he just automatically got picked up for this gig. It's like, no, he's got an amazing guitar player who understands Instagram and has got a 70,000 follower Instagram account or whatever that got him noticed. Or whatever. I have friends of mine that do session work a lot now that got into it, not because they got into a big studio. They were recording themselves and mixing themselves, and the stuff that they were recording and mixing sounded amazing and caught the attention of, whoever, and got them really busy.
Well, this is interesting because when I started my channel 2 years ago, I was 54 years old. I always said, in order to make a living as a producer, one of the advantages I had was that I could play all the different instruments.
Yeah.
I could write, and a lot of times I'd have to play other people's parts for them. If
Right.
it was the bass player couldn't play, if the guitar player couldn't play, and I could come up with parts. Well, I could also engineer and mix the records too. So in addition, if I had a singer-songwriter come in, I could create the entire band, and I could, engineer and mix the records. So it'd be a one-stop shop, and help co-write the songs if I had to. But then the social media
And crack the whip.
and
when
crack
you
the
need
whip.
to.
But the thing that people, I think, don't realize, I think people that are my age that are musicians, that the social media part of it, I didn't know anything about social media.
Yeah.
I started this YouTube channel because you recommended it.
Yeah.
I was on Facebook just posting stuff. I had some, big video. Dylan had some huge videos on Facebook, but I would get on there and talk and do things, but I didn't understand. I didn't have an Instagram thing. I didn't know anything about YouTube. I watched YouTube videos. If I wanted to learn something, I go to YouTube. I want to run a camera or whatever.
Yeah.
I never even considered it till you came in and said you should start a YouTube channel.
Yeah. And that's, a lot of people kind of, the internet has done, I guess, a lot of bad things for the music industry, but I also think it's done a lot of really great things for the music industry. YouTube being one of them. One of the artists that I've played for 5 years, who I actually met here through you, is Noah Guthrie, has a career because he had a viral video on YouTube when he was like 17, and that kick-started his career. And now, because of the internet, he and I can sit and write a song together, record it, shoot a video of it, post it, and then in a matter of hours have somebody in the Netherlands or South America watching it. And as to continue with him as an example, he has a pretty substantial following in Europe. He tours Europe quite a bit, strictly because of Spotify, strictly because of YouTube, because of his Instagram following. So if you know what you're doing as an artist nowadays or as a musician, you can use the internet, and you should be using the internet to your advantage.
And it's not, and anybody, I'm older than everyone here, and I was able to do it at 54. So if I can do it,
My God, what can we do?
Don't be intimidated by social media. I was rescued from producing things that I never wanted to do anymore. I'm honest about that. I was working on projects that I hated.
Yeah.
And I would say to my wife, I can't be doing this when I'm 60 years old, producing things that I hate. I don't want to be part of the problem anymore. I want to teach people things. And through the generous, people just buying my book and buying my mugs on my in my store.
Can I get one of those mugs?
Actually, I need one too. I don't have one either.
So because of that, I was able to stop becoming what I call part of the problem by producing horrible things that are all auto-tuned because everybody wanted their voice auto-tuned, and I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to quantize people's drum parts and do stuff like that. I hated that. That's not music to me. You can be any age and do this. I don't think people should feel intimidated by that, no matter how old they are. The social media thing can be helpful.
I mean, I don't think kids today are intimidated by social media.
No, kids. I'm talking older musicians.
I was telling Rick earlier today, I follow a couple of musicians that I've always liked, Andy Partridge from XTC and Robin Hitchcock on Twitter. And both of them I really love following for different reasons. Robin Hitchcock is this surreal kind of poet guy. He just writes these ridiculous tweets that are awesome. So that's one way. And then Andy Partridge has most recently been sort of transcribing some of his more famous guitar parts for people to pick out, which is great. Because he's always sort of been an aloof kind of guy. So they're both using that to be relatively in the mainstream for however they want to be. And they're connecting with fans. I know that one of the big things that's happening with touring now is fan experiences, or you come to the sound check and you sit there and watch us play, or you come and everybody meets beforehand, And now there's companies that are having these lavish meals and all this other crap that we would see, and it's just, I mean, I understand what it is as an experience, and even in like the pledge music model of putting out records. I'm in the middle of doing a record with Roger Manning and Eric Dover from my Jellyfish days that we were approached by Pledge Music because Roger's put out things on his own. Mm-hmm. But most of what he's had to do with that project have been things that people have bought, like, co-write a song with Roger, or he'll do a piano score, a vocal arrangement, or whatever. So these other things that you have talent at you can exploit in these different ways. And that's kind of hopeful, and that artists I can say, how did Andy Partridge play Earn Enough for Us on guitar? And there he's doing that. He should probably have a channel and do that because he's a pretty engaging dude. But I'm glad that you're embracing the technology, but you're also a teacher. You have something to say that people want to hear. I think part of what I see in social media are artists that are just pointing a camera at themselves and going, hey, this is where I am today, and it's all about them in a way that I just don't find engaging. You've got to have something that's interesting and unique and different for people to want to continue to watch you. The idea that people are going to sit and live their life watching you live your life is kind of like a failure, isn't it?
Well, I also think, too, that this is the answer to what we've seen in the last few years. If you just look at the guitar industry and how there's been this kind of, everybody's freaking out. Oh, guitar sales are down. Guitar is finally dying. The younger generations are not picking up instruments anymore. I don't necessarily see that because of Instagram. You have these young people on Instagram who are coming up, just some smoking players that are 16, 17 years old and even younger in some cases, that now have a platform and an outlet to then inspire other people. If when I was learning guitar at 12, 13 years old, I had Instagram and YouTube, I think I would be I don't think I'd be a better musician. I think I would have a more developed ear than I do now, just by being able to see and hear and be exposed to so much different stuff in an instant.
See, no, I think that you have a better ear when you had to actually drop the needle on the...
Yeah. And I would kind of maybe disagree with you from my own experience, because when I was at that age, at 10 and 11, and I've said this to you before, it's like you had to go out of your way to find a record store or a shop you could get a magazine that would have a band that somebody was talking about. You're always going to be pricking your ears up for things that are going to move you. I don't think that goes away at any age. In fact, I think the opposite has happened now, that there's so much available to everybody that it's just a saturation point of how can you even pick out anything of value? It has to be so ridiculously different for anybody to go, well, hang on, the bass player, the rhythm section was actually pretty badass. But I guess my point is that we have so much available to us, and there was something about taking the record out of the record sleeve. It had a smell to it. You put it on, you had to take care of it differently. It wasn't just track 7 on this.
No.
Whatever.
If you left your record in the car on a hot day, it was done.
Yeah, and you were connected to it, what's the word, tacitly, with your hand?
Tactily.
Tactily.
Yeah.
And you were connected to that, and it meant more to me because you could see it. It was the size that the artwork could have an impact visually. I miss those days.
So I'd like to thank these guys for being my guests today. Tim, you can follow Tim on, where can you follow you, Tim? On Facebook?
I'm on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. I'm around.
Rhett, you guys know, is I'll put their things in the description, and thanks everybody for watching.